of Ohio, this is from Peter in Steubenville. Dr. Anders, I am a cradle Catholic. I pray, practice my faith, try to continue to learn and grow in my faith. My wife is attending an EPC church, that is Evangelical Presbyterian Church. She has attended multiple denominations and non-denominational churches, but right now she's attending Mass with me every Sunday, and then I go to her service with her. Now, I don't participate in any of their communion services or confessions of faith, anything like that. Yesterday, the pastor made claims that the church built St. Peter's, that would be the Catholic Church, built St. Peter's with money from the sale of indulgences, and the church still sells indulgences. How should I deal with these kind of distortions and untruths? I don't expect him to teach Catholic doctrine, but I really hate it when I hear false statements about what the church teaches to a congregation that is ignorant of Catholic teaching. Thanks for your ministry, Peter in Steubenville.
Yeah, thanks, Peter in Steubenville. I appreciate the question. Well, the pastor's statement was half right. So the church did actually fund the building of St. Peter's in part with the selling of indulgences. However, the church does not sell indulgences. In fact, the selling of indulgences is against canon law. So how should you deal with it? Well, first of all, let me give you a little background on indulgences for those that might not know what they are or why the church would ever have countenanced the sale of them to begin with. Doesn't that just automatically present itself as the worst kind of corruption? And really, actually, there is a rationale for it, although it can be abused. Indulgences are attached to the sacrament of penance and the practice of penance, which is making reparation for sin. Even though we've received forgiveness, we do something to make reparation of the one we've offended. And in the ancient church, the penances that were imposed by ecclesiastical authorities could sometimes be quite lengthy. That might even go on for years. Somebody might be excluded from communion, for example, for several years or even unto their death. And during one of the great persecutions in the 250s, the Decian persecution, some people lapsed, they apostatized, and they were forced to do penance for their sins, while others were confessors and went to jail out of fidelity to the Catholic faith. And of course, they were venerated by the church and regarded as heroes. Well, some of the folks that were doing penance looked at these folks in jail and they said, there's some pretty righteous dudes over there, right? And so they wandered over to the jails and said, we have an idea. Would you be willing to substitute some of your meritorious activity you're suffering here in jail to on our behalf, that we might lessen the penances that the church has imposed? And some of these fellows in jail said, sure, and they wrote out writs of indulgence. Now, I want to point out, this was not something that the church imposed from on high. This was something that was born from the piety of the lay people themselves. And then they took it to Bishop Cyprian, and they said, hey, look what we came up with. And Cyprian said, okay, I like the logic. Because it accords with what we know about the communion of saints, that we bear one another's burdens. I just ask that you let the church distribute this thing, that it fall under the discretion of the bishop. And thus was born from the bottom up, not the top down, the practice of indulgences. Now, in order to gain an indulgence, the bishops would ask the faithful to do some pious good work. It could be prayers, it could be gifts to the poor, it could be giving alms. And there's nothing wrong with that in principle. And, since the church often, I give alms to my church, and in the knowledge that the church will turn around and do good works with it. Sometimes I give alms to the church because I think they're going to care for the poor. Sometimes a person might give alms to the church because, the HVAC went out. and we need some money to put the new air conditioner in, or the roof blew off and we need to put a new roof on. And there's really nothing wrong with that. Every Presbyterian church does that too. And they may not connect it to the practice of indulgences because they've forgotten about penance. But I've been in plenty of evangelical churches where the pastor's, wife gets up and makes a moving appeal and talks about how she sold her wedding ring to pay for the new roof on the building. Yeah. Or, some doctor gets up and talks about how he, dumped his third speedboat so he could contribute. I've seen this. And what do? They induce a kind of, group mentality and, maybe some guilt and maybe some euphoria. And I wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that sometimes there can be a bit of manipulation that goes on in these sorts of things. Not always, but it can happen. I've seen it happen in all kinds of communities. So I really don't think it's fair to level these sorts of accusations to the Catholic Church and not realize that this is the way people function. And yes, these things can be abused. They were abused in the High Middle Ages, and they
Sure.
led to just sort of straightforward, peddling of these things. And so the church recognized, because of the controversies around the Reformation, maybe this isn't such a good practice. If you're going to give alms for penance, why don't you give them directly to the poor? Let's not give them for St. Peter's, right? So that's the selling of indulgences is illegal. How should you deal with it when people misrepresent the church's history? Well, you could disabuse them. You could show them, in black and white in print that they're wrong.
That's right.
You could. I don't expect to be listened to, however.
You can also refer them to this podcast.
You could do that too.
Very good. Hey, Peter, thanks so much for listening. In a moment, we'll get to the phones at 833